The dirt road stretches endlessly ahead, swallowed by darkness so complete that your headlights seem to die just a few feet from your bumper. No street lights, no houses, no cell signal. Just you, the hum of your engine, and the suffocating silence of absolute isolation. Have you ever considered what happens in places where civilization has simply forgotten to exist? Where the rules that govern our safe, predictable world seem to bend and break? Tonight, we're traveling to 7 locations where the middle of nowhere becomes the middle of something far worse. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you experienced true darkness? Not the dim glow of a bedroom at night, but the kind of blackness that presses against your eyes like a physical weight. The kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The kind that exists only in places so remote that even light pollution hasn't reached them. These are the settings of our stories tonight. Places where people have ventured, confident in their safety, only to discover that isolation doesn't just mean being alone. Sometimes it means being alone with something else. Our first story takes place in the Nebraska Sandhills, a region spanning nearly 20,000 square miles of rolling grass-covered dunes. To give you perspective, that's larger than the entire country of Switzerland, yet only about half a person lives per square mile here. This isn't empty by accident. This is empty because nothing should really be here. The Sandhills are a geographic anomaly, the largest sand dune formation in the Western Hemisphere, stabilized only by a thin layer of prairie grass. Beneath your feet, it's just sand. Miles of it. And on certain nights, when the wind blows just right, you can hear it shifting underneath you like something breathing. Sarah Mackenzie was driving through the Sandhills in October 2016, returning from a wedding in Alliance, Nebraska, to her home in North Platte. She chose Highway 83, a route that cuts straight through the heart of the emptiest part of the region. For nearly 70 miles, there's nothing but grass, the occasional cattle ranch set so far back from the road you'd miss it if you blinked, and a darkness so total it feels prehistoric. Sarah later told investigators that she'd made this drive a dozen times before. She knew every curve, every rise and fall. She knew where the handful of ranch turnoffs were. She knew she'd be alone. What she didn't know was that on this particular night, at approximately 11:43 p.m., she would see a light in her rearview mirror. Not headlights. A single light, yellowish and flickering, like a lantern. It was keeping pace with her, about 100 yards back. Sarah assumed it was a motorcycle or maybe a farm vehicle, though neither made much sense at that hour on that road. She slowed down. The light slowed down. She sped up to 75 miles per hour. The light kept perfect pace. Here's what makes this truly unsettling. Highway 83 through that section is absolutely straight for over 20 miles. No turns. No side roads. Just a ribbon of asphalt cutting through emptiness. Sarah could see in her rearview mirror that there was nothing else on the road. No vehicle. No shape. Just that single swaying light, as if someone were running behind her car at 75 miles per hour, holding a lantern. She drove faster. 80 miles per hour. 85. The light stayed exactly the same distance behind her. Never closer. Never farther. 411 straight minutes, according to her car's dash cam, which was later reviewed by the Holt County Sheriff's Department. Then, as she crested a small hill, the light simply vanished. Not gradually. Instantly. As if someone had blown out a candle. Sarah pulled over, hyperventilating, and called 911. The dispatcher sent a patrol car, but it took nearly 40 minutes to reach her. When Deputy Marcus Chen arrived, he drove back along the route Sarah had taken, scanning with his spotlight. He found nothing. No tire tracks leaving the road. No footprints. No broken down vehicles. The asphalt was completely empty. But here's what Deputy Chen noted in his official report, and this detail was only released 3 years later after a Freedom of Information Act request. When he reviewed Sarah's dash cam footage, there was indeed a light visible in the rear window reflection. But there was something else. For exactly 3 frames, roughly 1/10 of a second, the light illuminated something. A figure. Deputy Chen described it as impossibly tall and thin, with what appeared to be arms that hung down past where its knees should be. The incident was classified as an unknown and filed away. But Sarah Mackenzie wasn't the first person to report the lantern on Highway 83. Archives from the Holt County Library include a newspaper clipping from 1971 describing a similar sighting. A traveling salesman reported being followed by a ghostly light carried by something that wasn't quite human along the exact same stretch of road. And in 1943, a handwritten letter in the collection describes homesteaders in the area warning travelers never to stop if they saw a light following them at night, because the lantern man doesn't want company, he wants to add to his count. What count? No one knows. But here's a verified fact that adds a layer of dread to this story. Between 1940 and 2020, 17 vehicles have been found abandoned along that 20-mile stretch of Highway 83. Empty. Keys in the ignition. Headlights still on. Doors open. No signs of struggle. No trace of the drivers. The most recent was in 2019. A truck belonging to David Hernandez, a rancher from Bassett. His coffee was still warm when the highway patrol found it. His phone was on the dashboard, showing he'd been in the middle of typing a text message. The message read, "Something is running behind my truck with a," and then nothing. David Hernandez has never been found. Ask yourself this. If you were driving alone at night and saw a light following you in the middle of nowhere, what would you do? Would you stop? Would you keep driving? And what would you do if, when you looked closer, you realized the light wasn't floating alongside a vehicle but was being carried by something running at highway speeds? Our second story takes us north, to the Alaskan wilderness near the Yukon border. This is a landscape where the word remote takes on a meaning most of us can't comprehend. The area around Eagle, Alaska, is accessible only by boat, plane, or a single unpaved road that's frequently washed out. The town itself has a population that fluctuates between 80 and 120 people. But the surrounding wilderness? That's measured in the millions of acres. The Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve alone covers 2.5 million acres of virtually untouched boreal forest, tundra, and mountains. To put that in perspective, you could fit the entire state of Delaware into it 2.5 times over. In July 2013, a group of 4 experienced hikers set out to explore a section of the preserve that few people ever visit. Marcus Webb, Jennifer Chu, Robert Dawson, and Kelly Patterson were all in their 30s, all seasoned outdoors enthusiasts with multiple wilderness expeditions under their belts. They filed their itinerary with the National Park Service, packed for 2 weeks, and headed into the backcountry with satellite phones and GPS trackers. Standard procedure. Everything by the book. On day 6, their scheduled check-in call came through as planned. Jennifer Chu spoke to the park ranger station, reporting that everything was normal. Weather was clear. Morale was high. They'd seen a grizzly bear from a safe distance and had found an excellent camping spot near a creek. She confirmed their coordinates and said they'd check in again in 48 hours. That was the last normal communication. 37 hours later, at 2:18 a.m., the emergency beacon on Marcus Webb's satellite device was activated. The signal transmitted for exactly 4 minutes before cutting off. The GPS coordinates placed them approximately 11 miles from their last reported position, which was odd because according to their itinerary, they should have moved only about 3 miles in that time. Rangers couldn't deploy until first light due to safety protocols, and by the time a helicopter reached the beacon's coordinates 9 hours later, what they found defied explanation. The campsite was shredded. And I don't mean messy. I mean systematically destroyed. The tents were torn into strips so uniform they looked cut. The backpacks had been opened and their contents arranged in a perfect circle, roughly 15 feet in diameter. Food, clothing, equipment, personal items, all placed equidistant from each other. In the center of the circle was a pile of rocks, stacked into a cairn about 4 feet high. Except the rocks weren't from the surrounding area. Geologists later identified them as granite with mineral compositions consistent with stone found over 50 miles away. But here's what made the searchers' blood run cold. Surrounding the circle, pressed into the soft ground near the creek, were tracks. The lead ranger, Thomas Kavish, who had 23 years of experience in the Alaskan wilderness, said in his official report that he'd never seen anything like them. They were vaguely humanoid. 2 legs, heel and toe impressions. But they were massive, at least 17 inches long and 8 inches wide. And the depth of the impressions suggested something weighing over 600 pounds. The tracks circled the campsite multiple times, then led directly into the creek and disappeared. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, no human remains. The satellite phone was found in the creek, waterlogged and destroyed. But most disturbing was what rangers found in Marcus Webb's GPS device, which had been left on a rock near the cairn. The device was still functioning, and when they accessed its data, they discovered something that shouldn't have been possible. The GPS tracking showed that between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., the 4 hikers had moved in a pattern that covered over 30 miles. But not in a straight line or even a wandering path. The pattern formed a shape. When plotted on a map, the GPS coordinates created a near-perfect spiral, with the campsite at its center. No human beings could have moved that fast, that precisely, through wilderness in complete darkness. The terrain was heavily forested, filled with obstacles, creeks, steep inclines. Yet the tracking data showed them moving at speeds exceeding 12 miles per hour, maintaining a mathematically precise spiral pattern that would require constant GPS monitoring to achieve. And they would have had to do this while somehow leaving no trace along those 30 miles, because search teams found no evidence of passage along the routes indicated. 4 months later, Kelly Patterson's driver's license was found by a hunter, wedged into the bark of a tree 18 miles from the campsite. The tree was analyzed by forestry experts who determined that the bark had grown around the license, suggesting it had been there for at least 15 years. But that was impossible. Kelly Patterson had carried that license into the wilderness 4 months earlier. The plastic showed no weathering, no aging. It looked brand new, except for being embedded in decades-old tree growth. None of the 4 hikers have ever been found. The case remains open. But here's something the National Park Service doesn't advertise. That area of the preserve, a roughly 40 square mile section, has been the site of 6 disappearances since 1978. Different years, different seasons, different types of groups. Hikers, hunters, even a Park Service biologist. All vanished without a trace. And in each case where campsites were found, there were details that didn't make sense. Arrangements of objects, strange tracks, equipment showing up in impossible locations. The local indigenous Gwich'in people have stories about that region going back generations. They call it a place where the land dreams, and they've traditionally avoided it. Their oral histories speak of something that lives in the deep forest, something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human, something that takes people into the spiral paths and they don't come back. Western science dismisses this as folklore, but the Gwich'in have occupied that land for thousands of years. They know something. Consider this. You're in a tent in absolute wilderness, hours from the nearest human being, and you hear footsteps circling your camp. Heavy footsteps that splash through a creek and keep coming. You shine your flashlight and see nothing, but the footsteps don't stop. They just keep circling, closer each time. What do you do? Where do you run when you're already in the middle of nowhere? Our third story takes place in the Australian outback, specifically in a region of South Australia known as the Painted Desert. This is a landscape so alien it barely looks like Earth. Eroded hills display layers of white, yellow, red, and purple stone, creating a vista that seems more like Mars than our planet. It's beautiful. It's also one of the most inhospitable places in Australia, which is saying something. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Water is virtually non-existent. The nearest town, Kuberpidi, is over 70 miles away. People who live in Kuberpidi literally dig their homes underground to escape the heat. In March 2011, Thomas and Vanessa Wright decided to drive through this region as part of an adventure tour of Australia's interior. They were experienced travelers from Melbourne, both in their late 20s, both well prepared with supplies, satellite communication, and a reliable four-wheel drive vehicle. They'd mapped out their route carefully, planning to spend one night camping in the Painted Desert before continuing north. The location they chose was legal for camping, a designated area about 40 miles off the Stewart Highway, accessible by rough dirt roads. They arrived in late afternoon and set up camp in a small valley between two of the colorful eroded hills. According to Vanessa's journal, which was later recovered, the sunset was spectacular. They cooked dinner, took photographs, and settled in for the night. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it does in desert environments. By 10 p.m., it was already down to 60 degrees from the afternoon high of 108. The silence, Vanessa wrote, was absolute. No wind, no insects, no birds. Just crushing, empty silence. At 11:37 p.m., Thomas heard the singing. That's how he described it when he was finally found. Not music, not chanting, singing. A woman's voice, clear and beautiful, carrying across the desert from somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp. The song had no words, just melody, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost familiar but weren't quite anything he'd heard before. Vanessa heard it too. They both stepped out of their tent and listened. The voice seemed to be coming from the north, from deeper in the Painted Desert. But that was impossible. They were the only people for dozens of miles. They'd seen no other vehicles, no tracks, nothing to suggest any human presence. Yet the singing continued, never getting louder or softer, just maintaining a constant volume as if the singer were standing exactly the same distance away. Thomas made a decision that probably saved his life. He didn't investigate. Something about the singing felt fundamentally wrong to him, though he couldn't articulate why. They retreated into their tent, zipped it completely closed, and tried to ignore the voice. The singing continued for 3 hours and 17 minutes. Vanessa timed it. Then it stopped, mid-phrase, as if someone had pressed a pause button. What happened next is documented in a series of frantic texts Vanessa sent to her sister in Melbourne via their satellite communicator. The device stored the messages with timestamps. At 2:54 a.m., something is walking around our tent. At 2:58 a.m., we can hear breathing right outside. Heavy breathing. At 3:03 a.m., it's scratching at the canvas. Tom wants to look, but I won't let him. At 3:11 a.m., it's asking us to come out. In that woman's voice. It knows our names. That last message is what makes this story transcend from frightening to genuinely horrifying. The voice outside their tent was calling their names. Thomas. Vanessa. Over and over. Come out, Thomas. Come see, Vanessa. The voice was beautiful, gentle, almost motherly. But they had told no one their names except the park ranger at Kuberpidi when they'd registered their camping permit, and he was 70 miles away. At 3:23 a.m., Vanessa sent one final text. We're making a run for the truck. Then nothing. When Vanessa's sister didn't hear from them by the following evening, she contacted authorities. A search was initiated. The South Australia Police, along with volunteer searchers, reached the campsite 2 days later. The tent was still standing, though the entrance was unzipped and hanging open. All of their belongings were inside, untouched. Food, water, camping equipment, even their wallets and passports. The truck was gone. At first, searchers assumed the couple had simply driven away in panic and gotten lost or stuck somewhere. But then they found the tire tracks. The truck's tracks led away from the campsite, heading north, deeper into the painted desert. Search teams followed them for 11 miles across terrain that became increasingly difficult, until the tracks reached an area of solid rock and disappeared. Not onto another surface. They just ended mid-trail, as if the truck had driven onto the rock and vanished into thin air. Helicopters searched the area extensively. The rock formation was essentially a flat plateau about 3 square miles in size. If the truck had driven onto it, there was nowhere for it to go. The edges were clearly visible, but there was no truck. Thomas Wright was found 6 days later, walking along the Stewart Highway, roughly 90 miles from where he'd disappeared. He was severely dehydrated, sunburned, and incoherent. He had no memory of how he'd gotten there. The last thing he remembered clearly was starting the truck and driving away from the campsite. Everything after that was fragments. Darkness. The singing continuing even inside the truck. Vanessa screaming. Lights that weren't headlights. And walking through a landscape that he described as wrong. When pressed by doctors and police to explain what he meant by wrong, Thomas became agitated. He said the desert had looked different. The colors of the rocks were moving, swirling like liquid. The stars were in the wrong positions. And he kept seeing figures in the distance, always just at the edge of vision, keeping pace with him as he walked. When he tried to approach them, they'd disappear, only to reappear somewhere else. Vanessa Wright has never been found. Neither has their truck. Search efforts continued for 3 months, covering hundreds of square miles. Nothing. Thomas underwent extensive psychological evaluation and was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but doctors couldn't explain his physical condition. Despite walking an estimated 90 miles through one of the harshest environments on Earth with no water or supplies, he showed signs of exposure consistent with only 24 to 36 hours outdoors, not 6 days. His muscle tissue showed no signs of the breakdown that would occur from that level of exertion. It was as if his body had experienced a different timeline than the calendar suggested. Here's where this story connects to something larger. The Painted Desert region is part of the traditional lands of the Arabana people, who have inhabited the area for over 30,000 years. Their oral traditions include stories about the singing spirits that live in the colored hills. These spirits, according to Arabana lore, are not malevolent but are guardians of boundaries between worlds. The songs they sing are invitations. If you accept the invitation, if you go toward the singing, you cross over into their world. And their world, while occupying the same physical space as ours, operates by different rules. Most anthropologists treat these stories as mythology. But in 1963, an anthropologist named Dr. Catherine Morehouse spent 3 months with an Arabana community documenting their traditions. In her field notes, never formally published, she recorded something interesting. The Arabana people she worked with refused to enter certain parts of the Painted Desert, claiming they were doorway places. When Dr. Morehouse asked what happened to people who entered these doorways, the elders told her that some come back, but they come back changed, missing pieces of themselves. And some don't come back at all, but you can hear them sometimes, added to the singing, calling for others to join them. Dr. Morehouse's notes also mention that she heard the singing herself on 2 occasions. She described it as the most beautiful and most terrifying sound she'd ever experienced, creating a simultaneous desire to move toward it and to run away. She never investigated the source. The final entry in her field journal, dated September 4th, 1963, reads, "I understand now why they stay away from the doorways. Some invitations shouldn't be accepted, no matter how beautiful the voice." Think about this for a moment. What would you do if you heard the most beautiful singing you'd ever heard, coming from the darkness in the middle of nowhere? Would you investigate? And what if the voice knew your name? Our fourth story takes us to the Scottish Highlands, to a region known as the Flow Country in Caithness and Sutherland. This is one of the largest and most intact blanket bog systems in the world, covering roughly 4,000 square kilometers. Blanket bogs are exactly what they sound like, a blanket of peat moss covering the landscape, creating a spongy, waterlogged environment that looks solid but often isn't. Step in the wrong place and you can sink up to your waist in cold, peaty water. The Flow Country is also one of the most isolated places in Britain. You can walk for days and never see another human being. In November 2008, Daniel MacLeod, a wildlife photographer from Inverness, went into the Flow Country to document the winter landscape and the golden eagles that nest there. Daniel was experienced, having worked in the Highlands for over 15 years. He knew the dangers of the bogs, knew how to navigate them, and had proper safety equipment. He told his partner Graham that he'd be back in 4 days. He had a GPS unit, a mobile phone, though coverage was spotty at best, and enough supplies for a week. Daniel didn't come back in 4 days. After 6 days, Graham reported him missing. Mountain rescue teams were deployed, along with helicopter support. They found Daniel's Land Rover parked at a trailhead exactly where it was supposed to be. Using the coordinates he'd logged in his GPS unit, which he'd synced with Graham before leaving, searchers tracked his route into the boglands. They found his final campsite 2 miles from where his GPS tracking ended. The tent was properly set up. His sleeping bag was laid out. A camp stove held a pot with the remnants of freeze-dried food. But Daniel was gone, and so was his camera equipment. More strangely, his boots were sitting neatly outside the tent, side by side, as if he'd stepped out of them carefully. No one goes into a Scottish bog in November without boots. The temperature was near freezing. The ground was saturated. It was effectively suicidal. Searchers found tracks. Bare footprints, confirmed by forensics to match Daniel's foot size and shape, leading away from the tent into the deepest part of the bog. The tracks were evenly spaced, suggesting a walking pace, not running. They led for almost half a mile before reaching an area of open water, a bog pool about 30 feet across. The footprints led directly to the edge of the pool and stopped. Divers searched the pool and found nothing. No body. No equipment. The pool, despite appearing shallow, was actually quite deep, over 20 feet in some places, with a bottom of thick peat that divers described as like swimming through pudding. But there was no trace of Daniel MacLeod. However, divers did find something else. At the bottom of the pool, partially buried in peat, were objects. Old objects. A corroded metal buckle dated to approximately the 18th century. Fragments of leather. And bones. Human bones. The bones were sent for analysis and were determined to be from at least 3 different individuals, with radiocarbon dating placing them across a range of time periods, the most recent from approximately 1950 to 1970, the oldest from the 1500s. This discovery prompted a broader investigation. Researchers began digging through historical records of disappearances in the Flow Country. What they found was disturbing. Since reliable records began in the late 1700s, there have been 23 documented cases of people vanishing in that specific area. Shepherds, peat cutters, hikers, a surveyor in 1932, and most recently, Daniel MacLeod. In 7 of these cases, evidence suggested the missing person had removed their footwear before disappearing. In 4 cases, witnesses reported that the missing person had been acting strangely before vanishing, describing them as entranced or sleepwalking. But here's the detail that transforms this from a series of tragic accidents into something far more unsettling. Graham, Daniel's partner, told police something that wasn't included in the official reports but was mentioned in the case file. Daniel had called him on the 2nd night of his trip. The mobile signal was weak and kept breaking up, But Graham remembered the conversation clearly. Daniel said he'd photographed something unusual. Lights in the bog, moving in patterns. Daniel thought they might be marsh gas, methane igniting spontaneously, which is a known phenomenon. But he said the lights seemed to move with purpose, almost like they were dancing. And he said he could hear music. Faint music, like pipes or flutes, coming from the direction of the lights. Graham told him to leave, to get out of there and come home. Daniel laughed, said he was fine, said he wanted to document the phenomenon. That was the last conversation they had. When investigators later examined Daniel's GPS data in detail, they found something peculiar. Between the time of that phone call and when the GPS tracking abruptly ended, Daniel had moved in a very specific pattern. He'd walked in loops, spirals actually, gradually moving toward the bog pool where his footprints were found. The pattern was too regular to be random wandering. It suggested someone walking in a trance state, or someone being led. Local tradition in the Highlands speaks of the slough, or spirit hosts, sometimes described as the unforgiven dead, who fly through the night and steal souls. But there are other older stories specific to the Flow country. The peat cutters who worked the bogs in centuries past spoke of the lights of the mire, which would appear on certain nights and lead travelers to their doom. But they didn't describe it as malicious. They described it as an invitation, a calling to join something ancient that lived in the deep peat, something that predated human settlement of the Highlands. There's a theory, proposed by Dr. Helena Vance, a folklorist at the University of Edinburgh, that these stories might have a basis in actual phenomena. Peat bogs preserve things. Bodies, objects, even organic materials, can last for thousands of years in the anaerobic environment of a bog. Dr. Vance speculates, and she emphasizes this as speculation, that certain locations in the Flow country might be places where the boundary between the living and the preserved becomes thin, where the accumulated memory of the bog, containing the remains of centuries of life and death, somehow manifests as sensory phenomena. Lights, sounds, presences. Is that scientific? No. But it's an attempt to rationalize a pattern of experiences that too many people have reported to dismiss entirely. And here's a fact that lends some credence to the idea that something unusual is happening in that specific area. A study conducted in 2015 by environmental scientists measuring methane emissions in the Flow country found unusual electromagnetic readings near the bog pool where Daniel MacLeod's tracks ended. The readings didn't correspond to any known geological feature and fluctuated in patterns that the researchers described as rhythmic, almost like a pulse. The study was never completed because funding was cut, but the preliminary data is publicly available and deeply strange. Daniel MacLeod's camera equipment has never been found. Whatever he photographed on those last nights is lost. Or perhaps not lost. Perhaps preserved at the bottom of a peat bog, where it will remain for thousands of years, along with Daniel himself, wherever he is. Imagine standing at the edge of a bog on a cold November night and seeing lights moving in the darkness. Hearing music that seems to come from the earth itself. Would you follow? And if you did, would you even realize you were following? Or would it feel like the most natural thing in the world to remove your boots and walk into the water? Our fifth story takes us to the American Southwest, to a stretch of desert in Nevada known unofficially as the Extraterrestrial Highway, though our story takes place away from the tourist areas. This is Nye County, the third largest county in the United States, covering over 18,000 square miles but home to fewer than 50,000 people. Most of that population lives in a handful of small towns. The rest is empty desert, military testing ranges, and mountains that rarely see a human footprint. In August 2017, 3 college students from Las Vegas decided to do some amateur UFO hunting in the desert outside of Rachel, Nevada. Rachel is famous for being near Area 51 and for embracing its alien hunting tourist trade. But Marcus Chen, Aisha Patel, and Colin Douglas weren't tourists. They were physics students at UNLV, and their interest was more scientific curiosity than true belief. They wanted to spend a night in the desert with telescopes and cameras to see if they could document anything unusual. It was supposed to be fun, a weird adventure to talk about back at school. They drove out on Highway 375 until they found a dirt road leading into the desert. About 10 miles off the highway, they set up camp in a flat area surrounded by low hills. The location was chosen because it offered a clear view of the sky with minimal light pollution. The nearest artificial light was Rachel, over 15 miles away. The nearest human beings, aside from themselves, were probably 20 miles away. It was perfect isolation for stargazing. According to Aisha's written account, given to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department 3 days later, everything was normal at first. They set up their equipment, cooked dinner on a portable stove, and watched the sun go down. The desert sunset was spectacular. As darkness fell, the stars emerged in a display that none of them had ever seen with such clarity. They took photographs, tested their telescopes, and joked about little green men. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Colin noticed something odd. Due west, in the direction they'd driven from, he saw lights. Multiple lights, arranged in a horizontal line, just above the horizon. They were yellowish-white, steady, not blinking. At first, they assumed it was a vehicle on the highway, maybe a truck with unusual lighting. But the lights didn't move. They just hung there, evenly spaced, about 7 of them. Arcus got out his binoculars and focused on the lights. What he saw confused him. The lights appeared to be floating above the desert surface with no visible source. Not attached to any structure. Not sitting on the ground. Just hovering, perfectly still. As he was describing this to the others, the lights went out. Not gradually. Simultaneously. One moment they were there, the next they were gone. That's when they heard the vehicle. An engine sound, coming from the east, the opposite direction from the lights. But they couldn't see any headlights. The sound got closer, definitely a truck or large vehicle, the rumble of a big engine echoing across the desert. It sounded like it was approaching their position, maybe half a mile away and closing. Still no lights. No visible vehicle. Just the sound of an engine in the darkness. The 3 students stood there, uncertain what to do. This was open desert, public land. It wasn't illegal for someone else to be out here. But driving without lights in the desert at night was extremely dangerous and highly unusual. The engine sound came closer. A quarter mile, based on the volume. Then it stopped. Abruptly. The silence that followed was so complete that Aisha said she could hear her own heartbeat. Then the lights came back on. But not in the same place. They were now south of their position, arranged in the same horizontal line, the same yellowish-white color. And between their campsite and the lights, they could now see a shape. Something large and dark, silhouetted against the faint illumination. It looked like a vehicle, a big one, but the shape was wrong. Too tall. Too angular. Colin made a decision. He shouted toward the shape, asking if everything was okay, if whoever it was needed help. No response. He shouted again. The lights went out. Complete darkness returned. And in that darkness, they heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps, crunching on the desert hardpan, coming toward them. Marcus turned on his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated nothing. Empty desert. But the footsteps continued, now closer, maybe 50 feet away. Aisha turned on her flashlight as well, sweeping it across the landscape. Still nothing visible. But all 3 of them could hear it now, clearly. Footsteps. Multiple sets. Walking toward them from different directions. Surrounding them. They ran to their car, a Honda Civic that suddenly seemed very small and fragile. They got inside, locked the doors, and Marcus started the engine. As the headlights came on, They illuminated the desert in front of them. Standing about 30 feet from the car were figures. 3 of them. Aisha described them as humanoid but wrong in their proportions. Too tall, over 7 feet. Too thin, arms that hung too long. And where their faces should have been, there was only darkness, even though the headlights were shining directly on them. Marcus put the car in reverse and backed up rapidly, trying to turn around to head back to the highway. As the car spun, the headlights swept across the desert, and they saw more figures. Dozens of them, standing in a wide circle around their campsite. All impossibly tall, all featureless, all perfectly still. Marcus drove. He didn't follow the dirt road. He just drove in what he hoped was the direction of the highway, bouncing over rocks and scrub brush, pushing the Honda to its limits. Aisha was looking out the back window and screaming that the figures were following. Not running, walking, but keeping pace with the car somehow, their long strides covering ground faster than seemed possible. The car hit a rock wrong and blew out the front right tire. They were still about 7 miles from the highway. Marcus kept driving on the rim, the car shuddering and pulling, but he didn't stop. Behind them, visible in the headlights' reflection, the figures continued to follow. They didn't gain ground, but they didn't fall back either. They just walked, maintaining exactly the same distance. After what Aisha estimated as 15 or 20 minutes of terror, they reached Highway 375. The moment the car's tires touched asphalt, the figures stopped. They stood at the edge of the desert, arranged in a line, and then, one by one, they simply faded away. Not walking back into darkness. Fading, becoming transparent, and vanishing. The 3 students drove on the destroyed tire all the way to Rachel, where they called the police. The Lincoln County Sheriff was skeptical but agreed to send deputies to investigate. The next day, officers accompanied the students back to the campsite to retrieve their abandoned equipment. What they found was disturbing enough to be included in an official incident report. The campsite had been completely dismantled. The tent had been taken apart, each piece folded neatly and stacked. The camping equipment was arranged in rows, organized by size and type. The telescopes were disassembled, every component separated and lined up on the ground. And in the center of the camp, someone had created a pattern in the dirt using rocks and pieces of their equipment. The pattern was geometric, a series of interconnected triangles forming a larger shape that none of the deputies recognized. But most disturbing were the footprints. The area around the campsite was covered with them. Large prints, at least 18 inches long and narrow, pressed deep into the hard ground. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet, suggesting something very tall. The prints led away from the campsite in multiple directions before disappearing into rocky terrain. A forensic expert later examined photographs of the prints and stated they didn't match any known human, animal, or vehicle track. Here's where this story intersects with a larger pattern. Nye County, despite its huge size, has one of the highest rates of missing persons cases per capita in Nevada. Between 2000 and 2020, over 40 people have vanished in Nye County under circumstances classified as unexplained. That's not counting cases where remains were eventually found or where circumstances suggested a known cause of death. 40 people who simply vanished without a trace. The most recent was in 2019, a geologist conducting a survey who failed to return to his hotel. His vehicle was found with all his equipment inside, doors locked, keys on the seat. No footprints leading away. No signs of disturbance. He simply ceased to exist. Is it aliens? The area's proximity to military testing ranges and the decades of UFO sightings suggest that explanation to many people. But there's another possibility that's even more unsettling. What if the phenomenon, whatever it is, has nothing to do with visitors from other worlds and everything to do with something that's always been here in these remote places, operating according to rules we don't understand? The indigenous peoples of the region, particularly the Western Shoshone, have traditions about shadow beings that inhabit the deep desert. These aren't malevolent spirits in their cosmology, but they're not human and they don't appreciate intrusion into their territory. The shadows walk on two legs, the old stories say, and they watch from the darkness. Most of the time they only watch. But sometimes, if you go too far into their land, they decide to watch more closely. And if you see them watching, it's already too late to leave without them knowing about you. What would you do if you were in that situation? Surrounded by figures in the darkness, figures that shouldn't exist but clearly do. Would you run? Would you try to communicate? And if you managed to escape, would you ever feel safe in the dark again? Our sixth story takes us to the Canadian wilderness of northern Manitoba, to a region near the Nunavut border that's so remote it doesn't have a name on most maps. This is the transitional zone between boreal forest and tundra, a landscape of stunted trees, countless lakes, and permafrost. The nearest permanent settlement is Churchill, over 200 miles south. In winter, temperatures regularly drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. In summer, the mosquitoes are so thick they can kill caribou calves through blood loss. It's not a place where humans are meant to be. In June 2014, a geological survey team flew into this region by helicopter to collect rock samples. The team consisted of 4 people. Dr. Elizabeth Morgenthal, the lead geologist, her graduate student assistant, Yuki Tanaka, and 2 support staff, helicopter pilot Raymond Foster, and field technician David Okeke. The plan was straightforward. Fly in, set up a temporary camp, spend 5 days collecting samples from an area of exposed bedrock that satellite imaging had identified as geologically interesting, then fly out. The helicopter dropped them at the site with enough supplies for a week and was scheduled to return in exactly 5 days. Everything was coordinated with the charter company, the university, and the Canadian Rangers. Standard procedure for remote field work. The helicopter lifted off, and the 4 team members set up camp near a small lake surrounded by the sparse, wind-twisted trees characteristic of the tree line. According to Dr. Morgenthal's notes, which were later recovered, the first 2 days were productive and uneventful. They collected samples, documented the site, and enjoyed the strange beauty of the landscape. The sun barely set at that latitude in June, providing nearly 24 hours of daylight. On the 3rd night, technically still day because the sun was above the horizon, Yuki noticed something odd. There were tracks near their camp. Large tracks, circular, roughly 8 inches in diameter, pressed into the soft ground near the lake shore. They looked almost like someone had pushed a large pipe into the ground repeatedly, creating perfect circles in a line. The tracks hadn't been there the previous day. They led from the lake, past the camp at a distance of about 50 yards, and back into the sparse forest. David, who had worked in the Arctic for several years, said he'd never seen tracks like that. They didn't match any animal he knew. Not bear, not moose, not caribou. Nothing. And the depth of the impressions suggested something very heavy, pressing straight down rather than the angled impression an animal's foot would make. They photographed the tracks and noted them in the field journal, but didn't think much more about it. On the 4th night, Raymond woke the others around 2 a.m. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows but still providing light. He'd heard something. A sound like humming, a deep resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. All 4 of them stood outside their tents and listened. The humming was real. They could all hear it, a low-frequency vibration that was almost more felt than heard, resonating in their chests. Yuki got out the field equipment and used a decibel meter with frequency analysis. The humming registered at approximately 52 Hz, right at the lower limit of human hearing. The strange part was that the frequency was absolutely steady. No variation. Natural sounds, wind, animals, even geological phenomena like small earthquakes, have variation. This was as steady as a machine tone. It continued for approximately 40 minutes, then stopped abruptly. They tried to rationalize it. Maybe a military installation they didn't know about, though there was nothing on their maps. Maybe some kind of geological activity, though the frequency wasn't consistent with anything Dr. Morgenthau had encountered in her 15 years of fieldwork. They decided to stay alert but continue their work. On the 5th day, the helicopter was scheduled to pick them up at 4 p.m. By 2 p.m., they had packed up their equipment and were waiting at the designated pickup zone, a flat area about 100 yards from their camp. At 3:30 p.m., Raymond's satellite phone rang. It was the charter company. The helicopter was grounded due to mechanical issues. A part needed to be replaced. They'd have a backup helicopter available in 2 days. Could the team extend their stay? They had enough supplies, so they agreed. It was frustrating but not dangerous. 2 extra days in the field wasn't unusual. They set their camp back up and settled in. As evening approached, or what passed for evening in the perpetual daylight, Yuki noticed the tracks again. More of them. Dozens of them now, forming a path that completely circled their camp. Perfect circles pressed into the ground, creating a ring approximately 200 feet in diameter with their tents at the center. That's when the fear started to set in. Something was visiting their camp at night, something large enough to leave deep impressions, and it was circling them. They gathered in one tent and discussed options. Hiking out was suicidal. They were over 200 miles from Churchill across terrain with no trails, countless lakes, and no way to navigate effectively. They had a GPS and maps, but the journey would take weeks and they didn't have enough supplies. Their only realistic option was to wait for the helicopter. They decided to set up a watch rotation and stay together. No one would sleep alone. As night approached, such as it was with the sun just dipping to the horizon, they heard the humming again. Louder this time. The tent fabric vibrated with it. And then they saw them. Lights in the forest. Multiple lights, moving between the stunted trees, coming closer. Dr. Morgenthau's notes described the lights as bioluminescent in quality, greenish blue, moving with purpose. The lights approached the ring of circular tracks and stopped, hovering just above the ground. There were 9 of them, evenly spaced around the circle. The humming intensified, making it hard to think. Yuki said later that she felt an overwhelming urge to leave the tent and walk toward the lights, an urge so strong that David had to physically hold her back. The lights remained for 3 hours. The humming never stopped. No one in the tent spoke. They just watched through the mesh window as the lights pulsed in rhythm with the sound. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The lights vanished. The humming cut off. Silence returned. When they finally worked up the courage to leave the tent at first light, they found that the circular tracks now formed 2 concentric rings around their camp. And in the exact center of the camp, where their tents were clustered, something had been placed. A rock. A smooth, spherical rock about the size of a basketball, sitting on the ground. The rock wasn't from the area. The local geology was granitic and sedimentary. This was basalt, dark and perfectly smooth as if polished. Dr. Morgenthau estimated it weighed about 40 pounds. Carved into the surface of the rock were symbols, lines and circles in intricate patterns that none of them recognized. The carvings were fresh, the interior of the grooves lighter than the weathered surface. Someone or something had carved this rock recently and placed it in their camp while they hid in the tent. The helicopter finally arrived 2 days later. The pilot noted in his flight log that the team seemed severely shaken and insisted on leaving immediately, abandoning some of their equipment. The carved rock was brought back and is currently stored at the University of Manitoba. It's been examined by geologists, archaeologists, and linguists. The symbols don't match any known human writing system or indigenous pictographic tradition from the region. The carving technique is equally mysterious, precise and deep, but with no tool marks indicating how it was done. The area where the team camped has been revisited once, by a follow-up expedition in 2016. They found the circular tracks, still visible despite 2 years of weather. They found the remains of the camp, and they found something else. In the forest, about half a mile from the campsite, they found a structure. Stones stacked into a formation roughly 12 feet high and 6 feet in diameter. The stones were the same basalt as the carved rock, not local to the area. The structure's purpose was unknown, but it appeared old, covered in lichens that suggested it had been there for decades, if not longer. The Inuit people and the Dene people of the region have oral histories that might be relevant. They speak of the landwalkers, beings that move across the tundra and forest when the sun doesn't set, beings that mark territories with stones and songs. The elders say the landwalkers have been there since before humans, and they don't appreciate intrusion. They mark territory. They warn. And if the warnings aren't heeded, people disappear. 7 people have gone missing in that region of northern Manitoba since 1990. All were researchers or explorers, people who went into the deep wilderness with experience and preparation. None have been found. The carved basalt rock sits in a storage room at the University of Manitoba, and occasionally researchers say they can hear it. A faint humming, just at the edge of perception. The university officially attributes this to auditory hallucination or building vibrations, but staff have requested the rock be moved to off-site storage multiple times. Imagine being in a tent in the Arctic, surrounded by lights and sounds that shouldn't exist, knowing that something is circling your position and you have nowhere to run. How would you maintain sanity? How would you resist the urge to walk out into the lights, even if every rational part of your brain screamed at you to stay hidden? Our 7th and final story takes us to the deserts of northern Chile, to the Atacama Desert, the driest place on Earth. Parts of the Atacama receive less than 1 millimeter of rain per century. This isn't hyperbole. Weather stations have been set up in certain areas for decades without recording a single drop of precipitation. The landscape is alien, vast plains of salt, rust-colored mountains devoid of vegetation, and a silence so profound it's disorienting. In some areas, the soil chemistry is so similar to Mars that NASA tests equipment there. In September 2018, an amateur astronomer named Ricardo Vega traveled to a remote part of the Atacama near the Shejnater Plateau. This area is famous for its astronomical observatories because the combination of high altitude, dry air, and lack of light pollution creates some of the best stargazing conditions on the planet. Ricardo had been there several times before. He knew the region, had permits for camping, and was experienced in desert survival. Ricardo's plan was to spend a week photographing the southern sky, particularly focusing on the Magellanic Clouds, which are small galaxies visible from the southern hemisphere. He drove a rented 4-wheel drive vehicle as far as the rough roads would allow, then hiked about 3 miles to a spot he'd scouted on a previous trip. The location was a flat area at an elevation of approximately 14,000 feet, completely isolated, with the nearest human habitation being the ALMA Observatory about 15 miles away. For 3 nights, everything went according to plan. Ricardo's journal entries, posted on his astronomy blog and later used by investigators, showed his enthusiasm. The sky was perfect, crystal clear, and he was getting phenomenal photographs. But on the 4th night, something changed. Ricardo's journal entry from that night was posted to his blog via satellite uplink at 9:47 p.m. The entry read, "The stars are wrong tonight. I've been observing the sky for years, and I know the positions of the major constellations and the galactic core from this location and time of year. Tonight, the positions are off. Not drastically, but measurably. I've checked my compass, my GPS, my planetarium software. Everything says I'm looking at the sky I should be looking at, but the stars are in the wrong places. I'm going to take detailed photographs and measurements to document this." That was his last blog post. When Ricardo didn't return his rental vehicle on the scheduled date, and when he stopped responding to messages from his family, the Chilean police were notified. A search team was dispatched to the area where he'd planned to camp. They found his vehicle where he'd parked it. They followed his hiking trail to the campsite, which was easy to track because there was only one approach that didn't require technical climbing. The campsite was undisturbed. His tent was set up properly. His equipment was organized. But Ricardo was gone. So was his main camera. His secondary camera was still there, sitting on a tripod. When police reviewed the memory card, they found something that defied explanation. The camera had been set to automatically take a photograph every 10 minutes throughout the night, a standard technique for documenting sky changes and creating time-lapse sequences. The photographs from the first 3 nights showed exactly what you'd expect. The Atacama landscape in the foreground, the spectacular southern sky above, the slow rotation of stars as the Earth turned. The photographs from the 4th night started normally, but beginning at approximately 11:15 p.m., things changed. The stars in the photographs began to show anomalies, streaks of light that didn't correspond to meteors or satellites, clusters of lights that appeared in formations that didn't match any known celestial objects. By midnight, the photographs showed the sky filled with lights, dozens of them, moving in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Then, at 12:37 a.m., a photograph captured something in the foreground. A figure, standing about 50 feet from the camera, silhouetted against the illuminated sky. The figure appeared humanoid, but the proportions were strange. The next photograph, taken 10 minutes later, showed the figure closer, perhaps 30 feet away. The photograph after that showed it even closer. This progression continued for 7 more photographs, each one showing the figure advancing toward the camera. The final photograph in the sequence, time-stamped at 2:17 a.m., showed the figure directly in front of the camera, filling the frame. The image was blurred, as if the figure had been moving, but certain details were visible. What appeared to be a face, though not human. Large dark areas where eyes might be. A shape that suggested a head, but elongated. The metadata on this photograph showed something impossible. The exposure time was set for 10 seconds to capture the faint starlight, but analysis showed motion blur consistent with the subject moving during the exposure. Yet the background stars showed no blur, suggesting the camera hadn't moved. The figure had moved during the 10-second exposure, swaying or shifting in place. After this photograph, the camera stopped recording. Not because the battery died or the memory card filled. The camera was simply turned off. When police found it, it was still on the tripod, powered down, with the memory card neatly ejected and placed on top of the camera body. Ricardo Vega has never been found. Search efforts covered a radius of 20 miles from his campsite using helicopters, ground teams, and thermal imaging. The Atacama Desert offers no place to hide. You can see for miles. There are no caves, no significant vegetation, nowhere for a person to go. Yet Ricardo vanished as completely as if he'd been erased. The photograph of the figure was analyzed extensively. Image experts confirmed it hadn't been digitally manipulated. Whatever was in front of the camera when the shutter opened was physically there. But no one could identify what it was. The proportions didn't match a human being wearing any kind of suit or costume. The height, based on comparison with the camera's known position, was estimated at over 8 feet tall. And the posture, the way the figure was positioned, suggested joints that bent in ways human joints don't. Here's where this story connects to a disturbing historical pattern. The Atacama Desert has a long history of unexplained disappearances. The indigenous Atacamino people, who have lived in and around the desert for thousands of years, have oral traditions about sky watchers who come down from the stars to walk the empty places. These aren't seen as aliens in the modern sense, but as beings who exist in the thin spaces where Earth meets sky, drawn to places where the atmosphere is so clear and dry that the boundary between ground and space seems to dissolve. Spanish colonial records from the 1600s describe monks and explorers vanishing in the Atacama, sometimes leaving behind reports of lights in the sky and figures that approached their camps at night. More recently, in 1994, a team of geologists from the University of Chile disappeared near the same area where Ricardo Vega camped. 2 of the 4 team members were eventually found, 3 weeks later and 70 miles from their last known position. They were dehydrated and incoherent but alive. When they recovered enough to speak, they described being taken to a place where the sky came down to the ground, where they walked among the stars, and where beings of light examined them before releasing them. They were both diagnosed with severe psychological trauma and never worked in the field again. The other 2 team members were never found. The Chilean government doesn't officially acknowledge these incidents as related, but there's an internal memo from the Carabineros, the Chilean police, that was leaked in 2019. The memo, dated 2012, recommends that civilian permits for solo camping in certain areas of the Atacama be denied due to environmental hazards and historical incident patterns. The specific areas mentioned include the region where Ricardo Vega disappeared. Ricardo's family hired a private investigator who uncovered one more detail. Ricardo's GPS unit, which was found at the campsite, showed movement data that wasn't in the police report. Between 2:30 a.m. and 4:15 a.m. on the night Ricardo disappeared, the GPS unit moved in a straight line for 12 miles across the desert, moving at a speed that varied between 15 and 30 miles per hour. Then the signal simply stopped, not lost due to battery failure or damage, but actively turned off. 12 miles in an hour and 45 minutes across rough desert terrain, while carrying equipment, in complete darkness. Impossible for a human on foot. The GPS coordinates where the signal stopped correspond to an area of absolute nothing, a flat expanse of salt pan with visibility for miles in every direction. Search teams found no footprints, no disturbed ground, and no trace of Ricardo or his equipment. There's a theory, proposed by Dr. Alejandro Soto, an anthropologist who studies the intersection of folklore and unexplained phenomena, that certain places on Earth act as thin points between our reality and something else. The Atacama, with its extreme dryness, high altitude, and crystal clear skies, might be one of these places. Dr. Soto suggests, and she stresses this is purely speculative, that when you're alone in such an extreme environment, particularly at night when the sky is overwhelmingly present, the boundary between observer and observed breaks down. The sky doesn't just watch you. You become part of it. And sometimes, something in that vast darkness notices and reaches back. Think about standing alone in the driest desert on Earth, under the clearest sky on the planet, with the Milky Way so bright it casts shadows. You're more alone than it's possible to be in most places on Earth. And then you notice the stars are wrong. The patterns you've studied for years are shifted. And then you see a figure approaching, tall and wrong, moving toward you with purpose. What would you do? Where would you run in a landscape with no shelter for miles? These 7 stories share common elements. Isolation, the middle of nowhere, encounters with something that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of reality, and disappearances or near disappearances that leave behind more questions than answers. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are documented incidents with police reports, witness testimonies, and physical evidence. The people involved were experienced, rational, and prepared. Yet something happened to them in those remote places, something that defied explanation. As you sit wherever you are, surrounded by the comforts of civilization, with lights and locks and the proximity of other people, consider this. The middle of nowhere isn't empty. It never has been. We've simply built our cities and towns in the places where we feel safe, leaving vast areas of the planet untouched and unobserved. And in those places, things exist. Things that operate by rules we don't understand. Things that notice when we intrude into their territory. The next time you're driving through empty country at night, or hiking in deep wilderness, or looking up at the stars from a place where no other lights shine, remember these stories. Remember the lantern follower of Nebraska, the spiral paths of Alaska, the singing in the Australian desert, the lights of the Scottish bogs, the tall figures in the Nevada wasteland, the humming circles of Manitoba, and the star watchers of the Atacama. Remember that the middle of nowhere is the middle of somewhere for things that were here long before us and will remain long after. And if you see something you can't explain, something that follows or calls or approaches in the darkness, don't assume you're imagining it. Don't assume it's harmless. Trust the fear that tells you to leave, to get back to the safety of populated places, to put distance between yourself and the empty lands. Because that fear is ancient. It survived in our genes for hundreds of thousands of years for a reason. It knows that some places aren't meant for us. Some darkness should remain unexplored. The 7 people who vanished from these stories are still missing. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, they remain. And the things that took them are still there too, waiting in the empty places, watching for the next person who wanders too far from the safety of the known world. Sleep well tonight, in your bed, in your town, surrounded by people and lights. And be grateful you're not alone in the middle of nowhere, where the watchers wait and the darkness is never truly empty.